August 24, 1942. Imperial Japanese 8th Fleet Headquarters, Rabaul, New Britain. The intelligence report on the Australian desk that day contained a number that would get roughly 2 from 800 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force Marines killed or stranded within 2 weeks. Third, it stated that the Allied garrison defending a remote harbour on the eastern tip of Papua, a place called Milne Bay, consisted of 2 or 3 infantry companies, maybe a few hundred men, mostly construction troops building an airstrip, poorly armed, poorly led, and unlikely to put up serious resistance. The actual number, sitting in the mud and rain waiting for them, was almost 9,000 Allied troops, including 2 full Australian infantry brigades. That gap between what Japanese planners believed and what was actually waiting in the jungle is where this story lives. Not in a single battle, but in the space between a reputation, the Japanese Empire had spent 8 months building across half the Pacific, and the one force that refused to let that reputation apply to them. By August 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army hadn't just been winning, it had been terrifying. Malaya fell in 10 weeks. Singapore, supposedly Britain's impregnable fortress, surrendered on February 15, 1942, in what Winston Churchill himself called the worst disaster in British military history. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. The Dutch East Indies collapsed by March. The Philippines were overrun by May. Everywhere Japanese infantry moved, they moved through jungle terrain that Western militaries had trained their whole careers to avoid. And they moved fast, aggressive, merciless, and largely unstoppable. By the middle of 1942, Japanese invincibility wasn't propaganda. For most military planners in the Pacific, simply an accepted fact you built your strategy around. Before I go further into what happened when that reputation ran directly into Australian infantry in the mud of Papua New Guinea, I want to ask you something, because this channel only works if the people watching it actually talk back. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. Whether it was Kokoda, North Africa, the Atlantic, or somewhere else entirely. I read every single comment, and it's genuinely part of why I keep making these. Now, back to Milne Bay, the Japanese landing force that came ashore on the night of August 25-26, 1942, wasn't a second-rate unit sent to soften up an easy target. It included men of the Kuri 5th Special Naval Landing Force, Japan's version of naval infantry, trained for exactly this kind of amphibious assault, backed by light tanks and combat engineers. These were not green troops. Many had already fought through earlier Pacific campaigns. On paper, against what Japanese intelligence believed was a lightly defended construction outpost, this should have been a formality. What they actually landed against was a hardened, reinforced garrison. The 7th Australian Infantry Brigade, militia troops, some of them barely trained, named derisively Chocos, short for chocolate soldiers, meaning men expected to melt under real pressure, had been building defences at Milne Bay since July. But by mid-August, they'd been reinforced by the 18th Australian Infantry Brigade. Veterans of the siege of Tobruk in North Africa, men who had already spent 8 months under sustained German and Italian attack in the desert before being shipped straight to a tropical jungle on the other side of the world. Behind them sat 2 squadrons of RAAF Kittyhawk fighters, No. 75 and No. 76 Squadron, flying close air support from a secret airstrip carved directly out of a coconut plantation. The Japanese didn't know any of this. They landed 11 kilometers from their intended beachhead, in the dark, in driving rain, expecting to walk unopposed to an airstrip defended by a skeleton crew. Within 72 hours, that miscalculation would produce something that hadn't happened anywhere on land. In any theater, since the Japanese Empire entered the war on December 7, 1941. A Japanese ground force, thrown back, broken, and evacuated in defeat. Field Marshal Sir William Slim, commanding the British 14th Army in Burma at the time, fighting the same enemy under similar jungle conditions, would later write about what those Australians accomplished with a bluntness rare for a fellow general assessing an Allies' victory. He said Australian troops had, at Milne Bay, inflicted on the Japanese their first undoubted defeat on land, and that if the Australians could do it in conditions just like his own, so could he. That single sentence from one of the most respected Allied commanders of the entire war, is where the myth of Japanese invincibility started to crack. What happened on the beaches and jungle tracks of Milne Bay over the next 12 days is the story of exactly how it broke, August 26, 1942. Just after midnight, the northern shore of Milne Bay, the first Japanese barges hit the beach at Ahioma, 11 kilometers east of where the invasion plan said they should have landed. It was a navigation failure that would cost them dearly, but at the time it barely registered as a problem. Japanese commanders still believed they were walking into a lightly held construction site. What they actually walked into was a fight that would grind on, day and night, through some of the worst terrain Australian troops encountered anywhere in the entire war. The geography itself was almost designed to punish an attacker. Milne Bay sits in one of the wettest regions on Earth, a narrow strip of coastline squeezed between the sea and jungle-choked mountains laced with swamps, coconut plantations, and a single muddy track connecting the landing beaches to the airstrips the Japanese needed to capture. There was no room to maneuver. Every advance had to come straight up that track, into whatever the Australians had waiting. And what they had waiting, from the very first night, was air power the Japanese hadn't planned for. On August 25 and 26, before the main landing force had even fully disembarked, Kittyhawk fighters from No. 75 and No. 76, Squadron RAAF, caught Japanese landing barges in the open and destroyed a significant number of them, stranding roughly 350 Japanese troops on nearby Goodenough Island, cut off from the main force entirely before the land battle had properly begun. It was a preview of the entire campaign, a Japanese plan built on the assumption of easy, unopposed movement running immediately into a defender who refused to let that assumption hold. For 2 nights and days, the Japanese pushed west along the coast toward the vital No. 3 strip airfield, using light tanks to spearhead attacks through the dark, a tactic that had worked for them across Malaya and the Philippines. In the swamps around Milne Bay, tanks became a liability rather than a weapon, bogging down in mud that Australian infantry moved through on foot. Still, the pressure was relentless. By August 31, Japanese forces had fought their way to the very edge of No. 3 strip, close enough that its loss would have handed the entire bay to the invasion force. That night produced the battle's turning point. In the early hours of September 1, 1942, Japanese troops launched 3 successive assaults directly across the open airstrip, trying to overrun the Australian and American positions dug in on the far side. Each assault walked into a wall of coordinated machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire from troops who had chosen their ground and prepared it. All 3 attacks were repulsed with heavy Japanese casualties. It was the single costliest night of the entire campaign for the invading force, and it broke the momentum of the entire operation. From that point forward, the Japanese were no longer attacking. They were trying to survive the Australian counterattack that followed, pushing the Japanese back along the same muddy coastal track they'd advanced on days earlier, produced one of the campaign's most documented acts of individual courage. On September 4, 1942, Corporal John French of the 29th Battalion, advancing against a line of Japanese machine gun positions that had pinned down his platoon, moved forward alone under fire, and over a matter of minutes charged and captured 3 separate enemy gun pits in succession. He was killed completing the assault. For his actions, French was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in the Commonwealth Honours System, and one of the very few awarded during the entire New Guinea campaign. By the first days of September, the Japanese position at Milne Bay had become untenable. Sickness, exhaustion, and mounting losses had gutted the invasion force's ability to continue offensive operations, and even Japanese commanders on the ground began recommending withdrawal rather than reinforcement. A recommendation that, remarkably, Imperial General Headquarters accepted. On the night of September 6 to 7, 1942, what remained of the Japanese landing force was evacuated by sea from the same beaches they had come ashore on less than 2 weeks earlier. Of roughly 2,800 Japanese troops originally landed, only about 1,318 re-embarked. Historians estimate as many as 750 were killed in the fighting or died attempting to escape overland toward the Japanese base at Buna. Several captured Australian soldiers were found to have been bayoneted by retreating Japanese troops, a detail confirmed in post-war Australian official accounts, and one that underscores how brutal the final days of the withdrawal became. Australian casualties totaled 373, including 167 killed or listed as missing. 14 American engineers, who had fought alongside the Australians, defending their own airstrip, were also killed. It was the first time since Pearl Harbor that a Japanese landing force had been put ashore, fought, and thrown back into the sea in defeat. The myth, built across 8 months and half a continent, had just met the one infantry force that didn't know it was supposed to lose. September 7, 1942. Rabaul, New Britain. Imperial Japanese 8th Fleet Headquarters. The after-action reporting that came back from Milne Bay landed on the same desks that, less than 2 weeks earlier, had confidently estimated the Allied garrison at 2 or 3 companies. Now, those same planners had to explain how a landing force built around veteran Special Naval Landing Force Marines and light armor had been thrown back into the sea by what their own intelligence had dismissed as a lightly defended construction outpost. There was no way to frame that outcome as anything other than what it was. The first time since the war began that a Japanese amphibious landing had failed outright. What matters for this story isn't just that Milne Bay was a defeat. Singular defeats happen in every war. Fighting. What matters is what it did to how the Japanese High Command approached the Australians who were still standing between them and Port Moresby. Because at the very moment the Milne Bay evacuation was underway, a separate, much larger Japanese force under Major General Tomitaro Horii was still grinding its way south over the Owen Stanley Range along the Kokoda Track, driving toward that same objective. Strategically, Milne Bay changed the math on that campaign too, for the plan had always been a pincer. Horii's force pushing overland across the mountains while a second force landed by sea at Milne Bay to threaten Port Moresby from the east and provide air and naval support for the final push. With the eastern landing destroyed, that pincer collapsed into a single overextended arm. Horii's men, already fighting at the end of a supply line stretched across some of the most punishing terrain on Earth, were now doing it with no prospect of reinforcement or support from the direction the original plan had counted on. Australian forces would go on to halt and reverse that advance too, beginning their counteroffensive along Kokoda on September 25, 1942. Just over 2 weeks after the last Japanese troops were pulled out of Milne Bay. The psychological effect reached further than the battlefield itself. For Allied forces fighting the Japanese Empire anywhere in Asia in 1942, the invincible reputation Japan had built since Pearl Harbor was, in practical terms, a weapon in its own right. It shaped how defenders planned, how confidently they held ground, and how quickly units broke under pressure. Field Marshal Slim, fighting a demoralized British 14th Army in the retreat through Burma, at almost the exact same time, later wrote plainly about what the news from Milne Bay did for men under his own command. It was, in his words, a cheering piece of news that he made good use of as a morale raiser, because if Australian troops in jungle conditions very like his own had beaten the Japanese on the ground, then his own men could believe they could too. That is what a broken myth is actually worth in wartime. Not just ground held, but fear removed from an enemy who had spent 8 months trading on exactly that fear. None of this erases what Japanese forces had genuinely accomplished, or the terror those earlier campaigns had rightly produced. The soldiers who came ashore at Milne Bay in August 1942 were largely the same kind of veteran, disciplined infantry who had taken Malaya and Singapore and Hong Kong at a pace that stunned military planners on every side. Even in defeat, Australian and Allied accounts of the fighting described a Japanese rearguard that fought with the same discipline and ferocity that had defined the Empire's advance everywhere else. A skilled, determined retreat that cost the Australians dearly for every kilometre of coastline they reclaimed. Milne Bay was not a story about a weak enemy. It was a story about a strong enemy meeting, for the first time, a defender whose confidence did not crack in the way Japanese planning had assumed it would. That distinction is the actual answer to the question in this video's title. The Japanese Empire spread terror across the Pacific because, again and again, it encountered forces that had been told, implicitly or explicitly, to expect defeat once the fighting turned desperate. What Japanese command found at Milne Bay, and what Hori's exhausted men found waiting for them on the Kokoda track weeks later, was a force built from something different. Militia units mocked before the war as chocolate soldiers, reinforced by hardened veterans of Tobruk who had already survived a European desert siege before ever setting foot in a Pacific jungle. Men who, by every intelligence estimate the Japanese Empire had available, weren't supposed to be there in the numbers they were, weren't supposed to hold, and weren't supposed to win. The Australian War Memorial's own post-war assessment is blunt about what the battle actually proved. That Japanese soldiers were not invincible in the jungle, even while outnumbered roughly 4-1 in the air and facing an enemy that had never once, since December 1941, been stopped on land. Of the nearly 800 men who came ashore at Milne Bay, believing they were walking into an undefended airstrip, roughly 1,500 never left Papua alive or free. That is why, for the rest of the New Guinea campaign, Japanese commanders stopped treating Australian infantry as an afterthought and started treating them as the one force in the Pacific that had already proven the Empire's reputation for terror had a limit.